Hello my friends, this is Aaron Beverly, aka your public speaking mentor, and today we are going to go over another critical review of my semifinal speech in 2019. For those of you who may not know, in 2019 I won the World Championship of Public Speaking. But before I could get to the World Championship of Public Speaking, I first had to win the semifinal round. That speech is the speech that helped me get to the World Championship and is the one that we will be reviewing today. And similar with other critical reviews that we've done in the past, I will be going over some of the logic behind my choices in the speech, as well as some areas of opportunity that I believe I could have improved upon. But all in all, I hope to give you some principles and techniques that you can use for your own speeches in the future. Now, if you get any value from this content at all, please do me a huge favor and hit the like button for the YouTube algorithm, because it really does help out the channel a lot, and it puts more of this content in front of others who may need it. With that, let's jump into the review. Now first, let's go into the background of this speech. This speech was different, and it was different in multiple ways. In the semifinal speech, I decided to use a multiple story model versus a single story model. I used a single story model in the World Championship of Public Speaking, basically just telling one long story before I gave you my point at the end. However, with the semifinals, I decided that I was going to go with multiple short stories and then give you my point and message at the end. So this goes to show you that you can win in the International Speech Contest multiple ways. You can tell multiple stories or you can tell a single story. The number of stories doesn't necessarily matter. Something else that makes this speech different is that it's not a hero story. In the International Speech Contest, you get a lot of speeches that utilize the hero story, where you have a character who overcomes a problem, usually with the help of some guide or a hero who helps them along the way. In 2019, I decided not to go with a hero story model. So you're not going to see a character that had a problem and a hero helped them along the way. What you're going to see is just a couple of stories that I told to the audience, and then I tied those stories together around a central theme. Now, one of the reasons why I wanted to be different was personal. I wanted to fight this thought of the formula that everybody seems to think about when it comes to the International Speech Contest. People tend to think that in order to win the World Championship of Public Speaking or to be successful in the International Speech Contest period, you have to tell a certain story a certain way, you have to use certain techniques in order to advance. I wanted to fight that way of thinking. That's why I decided that I wasn't going to do a hero story. I wasn't going to use a 3-story model, which is another popular model that a lot of people use. I was just going to tell some stories that were important to me, and that was what I was going to do. And there are a whole bunch of other myths that people like to say about the International Speech Contest. If you know any of the myths that people say are a part of the formula, let me know in the comments down below. Another point about the background of this speech is that it was multiple years old by the time I gave it on stage in 2019. I had this idea in my head back in 2013. I wanted to tell multiple family stories, but I just didn't know how to combine them at the time. So I decided just to stick the stories in my story file and wait. In 2018, I finally figured out how I could tie the stories together. So I took them out of my story file and I started to use them in the 2018 International Speech Contest, which I got all the way up to the district level, which is about round number 4, before I ultimately came in second and did not advance further in the contest that year. But key lesson here is that you never throw away your stories or your speeches just because they didn't get the result that you wanted the first time. I decided to keep refining the stories, and I found a different way to tie the stories together. So if you are a competitor in the International Speech Contest, I implore you, do not throw away your old material. Okay, now that we've gotten through the background, let's jump into the speech. Like other reviews that we have done in the past, I am going to be interjecting my thoughts and opinions as the speech proceeds. Also, like other reviews that we have done in the past, I am not going to show this speech in its entirety straight through. I am going to be breaking it up into multiple pieces. So if you want to see the entire speech without any interruption, you can click on the link in the description below.
Aaron Beverly, the greatest stories that you'll ever hear. The greatest stories that you'll ever hear, Aaron Beverly.
The first point I'm going to cover is the title. The greatest stories that you will ever hear. I wanted the title to be bold. I wanted it to be challenging, and I wanted it to spark intrigue with the audience. Basically, I wanted my audience to think, What are the greatest stories that I'll ever hear? Or, I bet his stories aren't better than mine. No matter what the audience thought about the title, there was one thing that I knew for sure. I was conditioning them to be ready to listen to stories. In addition, I also used this title as a setup. I was going to later subvert people's expectations on what the greatest stories were. So this is just another example of how you can make your titles work for you. And if you know me at all, you know that I am very good at making sure my titles are used to my advantage.
Since the dawn of time, families have loved to share stories. In fact, I can picture a caveman telling the first ever family story. He'd stand by the fire, look at his wife and children, then he'd say, "Ugh." That story would be passed down for generations.
Another point that I'll bring up in this part is how I opened the speech. If you notice, I open my speech in a way that people tell you not to open a speech. Once again, I opened my speech with a joke. And of course, this is another part of the formula. People say that you cannot start with a joke. And since somebody at a high position said this before, people just followed along, not really examining what that truly meant. When people say don't start with a joke, what they really should say is don't start with an untested joke. If you have a joke that you know works, that people have laughed at in the past and fits your story or your speech, use it. The jokes you should really stay away from are jokes that come at the expense of another person or at the expense of a certain people or a certain background or a certain culture. Those are the type of jokes that you want to avoid. But if you just have a general joke that you know is funny, use it. And one thing that I know about jokes is that sometimes they can be so bad that they're good. There's a reason why dad jokes are in right now. And that joke was definitely under the category of dad joke. Interestingly enough, in previous versions of that speech, I had a much longer version of that joke that was even less funny.
Imagine a caveman telling his children the first ever story. Daddy see big rock. Daddy pick up rock. Daddy pause for dramatic effect. Then Daddy throw rock. And the children would go, wow.
The best part about a joke is that they're quick. And I had made the mistake in earlier rounds of continuing this joke long after it was funny. So what I did as I progressed through the different rounds of the contest, I tried to find out exactly where people were laughing, how long they were laughing, how strongly they were laughing. Eventually, I condensed the joke into what it became in the semifinals. But even if there were people who didn't find that joke funny, there was still something else that I had in my back pocket. And that was the visuals that I was creating as I was giving that joke. For instance, I just talk about cavemen and how they're around the fire, how the caveman looks at his wife and children. Now, these are just basic words that I'm giving you, but in your mind, you're probably building a scene around these cavemen. Maybe you see them in a cave, or maybe you see them outside. What is it outside? Is it light or is it dark? Maybe you see them in the darkness. Maybe you see them in light. I don't know what you see, but you're going to be building visuals as I give you the scene. And that mental engagement is going to work in my favor as I continue to tell my story. So regardless of whether you found the joke funny or cringy, you were going to be mentally engaged through the visuals.
Contest chair and friends, humans and stories have evolved, yet one fact remains unchanged. Families love to share stories. Because a family story has a special power. A power that leads me to say that my family has the greatest stories that you will ever hear.
Now, this is one of the rare instances where you will actually hear me give that contest chair, Toastmasters, and guest line. I absolutely despise that line. It is one of the necessary evils of Toastmasters. I tried to circumvent it in any possible way that I can, but because it was the semifinals, I didn't want to take any chances, and I delivered the line in the more natural way. Madam Contest Chair, fellow Toastmasters, and honored guest. Who the hell talks like that? Okay, I will now get off of my soapbox. Back to the review. Now, my transition, humans and stories have evolved, was a way for me to fit my joke into the speech naturally. Again, you don't want to tell a joke that doesn't fit with your speech. Finally, my line that my family has the greatest stories that you will ever hear is used as a way to set up multiple things. Number one, it sets up my transition. Number two, it sets up my future subverting of your expectations. And third, it just sets up that mental engagement again about, maybe you do have some good family stories, but are they truly better than mine? Again, if I'm getting my audience to think something like that, that's going to work in my favor.
One of my favorites features my mother, my auntie, and my uncle. 60 years back when they were tiny mother, tiny auntie, and tiny uncle. 8, 7, and 5 years old.
Now, if you're really astute, you probably noticed that I had a little bit of a slip here.
60 years back.
This was a mental conflict between a previous version of my speech. In previous versions of the speech, I decided to say way back. The current version was 60 years back. The reason why I made this change was because the word 60 is a sensory, meaning that it invokes one of the 5 senses. If I say 60, you probably see the number 60. Or maybe when I say 60 years back, you see a calendar. Maybe you see some type of time travel. I don't know. But one thing I do know is that the word 60 is a lot more visual than just saying way back. So whenever you can, make sure that you're using more sensory evoking words. Here I introduce my mother, my auntie, and my uncle as characters in the story. But if you use names, it can be a bit confusing. So I decided, like in previous speeches, like the Bus Lady of Doom in 2016, or the Ominous Smiler in my 2019 World Championship speech, to name the characters by their traits instead of using their actual names. Something else to point out in the introduction of these characters is what I'm not telling you. A lot of times people will add a whole bunch of details that do not matter. What you want to do is give the audience enough information so that you can move along in the story or the speech. Now let's go over some of the details that did not matter. It didn't matter how the children looked. It didn't matter what clothes they were wearing. It didn't matter what the house looked like. If I gave you these extra details, it would have been nice, but it's not going to be purposeful for anything in the speech later down the line. Now, details that did matter, their ages and their heights. The ages were important because the children have to be at a young age to do something this, well, childlike. And also, I wanted to give you some details about the height and the social dynamic between the siblings. And it was as simple as giving you the hand gesture for how small that they were. So in the speech, you could clearly see that my mother was the oldest, that my auntie was the middle child, and tiny uncle was the youngest of the 3. And I didn't necessarily have to tell you how tall they were. I actually was able to show you through my body movement. And speaking of body movement, there was another reason why I decided to introduce them in that way. And that reason was I wanted to start anchoring my characters with certain body positions rather than anchoring the characters on the stage. If you are familiar with anchoring, when you stand on a certain part of the stage and you enact a certain character, that is going to be the spot where you enact that character and you don't enact them on any other part of the stage. The challenging part with anchoring your characters like that is that you always have to remember where to stand for what character, and it may take you time to move to that certain part of the stage. I didn't want to do that. I wanted for everything to focus around me. To avoid all of that, I decided to go with what I call self-contained anchoring. Meaning that I just have a certain body position or a movement that I do that will let you know that I am portraying a certain character. Meaning that my anchoring is all self-contained in me. I don't have to stand on a certain part of the stage. I'm just going to give a certain type of movement.
One morning before dawn, my grandparents were still asleep, but the children were wide awake and bored. So Tiny Mother said, "I have a fun idea. Let's take a ball and roll it down the stairway." Tiny Auntie said, "That is a great idea." Tiny Uncle said, "Okay."
Now this clapping was done intentionally because I wanted to add what I call audible variety. We all know of vocal variety, but audible variety is any sound that you make as you are telling your story or giving your speech. But in addition to the audible variety, the clapping was also used as a way to show the enthusiasm of Tiny Uncle as well as start setting up the repetition that I will be using throughout the speech. Speaking of setup, the entire first part of this story was all setup. If you notice, nothing's really out of the ordinary. This is just kids being kids. But there is a strategy behind this, because now I'm going to start escalating the conflict and escalating the tension.
They ran, grabbed the ball, rolled it down the stairway. And it was fun. Perhaps too much fun. Because then Tiny Mother said to her siblings, "Do you know what else we can roll down the stairway?" They said, "No." "What?" "A car tire."
As I said, escalation of the tension and the conflict. Now we have a car tire that's about to be rolled down the stairs, and people are starting to laugh at this concept. But why are they starting to laugh now? To understand some of the reasons why people would laugh at this point of the speech, you have to understand some of the theories around humor. There are 4 theories of humor that I'll share here. You have the superiority theory, you have the incongruity theory, you have the relief theory, and lastly, you have what's called the benign violation theory. The superiority theory of humor is usually the jokes that come at the expense of somebody else. You're laughing at someone because you don't have to feel their pain, and because of that, you find that funny. The theory is you laugh at these types of jokes because they're not about you, they don't involve you, you're so far removed that you feel superior to this situation, and therefore it's funny to you. This type of humor I generally stay away from unless I am the focus of the joke. The incongruity theory can basically be explained as you're expecting one thing, and then you all of a sudden get another thing that you weren't expecting. And that incongruity is what makes you laugh. The relief theory is one that comes as a result of building up some tension and then all of a sudden alleviating that tension. For instance, if you're in front of another person and you're about to fall and then you catch yourself, you look back at that person and then you both chuckle. That's the relief theory in action. You're relieved that you didn't fall, but you know that you could have, and that is what's going to cause you some nervous laughter. Then you have the benign violation theory. This one is a little bit different because it basically says that there are going to be certain factors that need to apply before you can possibly find this funny. With the benign violation theory, there's something that you shouldn't be laughing at, but because a certain amount of time has passed or because the events aren't that big anymore, you can laugh and not feel guilty about it. Now, if you want me to go in more detail about these theories in future videos, I can do that. But for the purpose of this video, I want you to know that people are probably laughing at this car tire because of the incongruity theory. Because there's a car tire that's about to be rolled down the stairs by a group of children. Number 1, a car tire should not be in the house. And number 2, a car tire is not something that you just roll down the steps like a ball. The incongruity now creates the humor.
You sound confused. Where on earth did 3 children get a car tire, right? Well, the night before, my grandfather brought home a spare car tire. Tiny Mother thought it would be a joy to roll it down the stairway.
Now in this part, I have to do a little bit of explaining of the car tire, because this is so absurd that I don't want people to challenge if it's actually true. So I have to give you a reason why the car tire is there, so that the audience doesn't have this question in their mind about where the heck did this car tire come from? If you create questions in the audience's mind and do not answer them, they're going to keep thinking about it and it may become a distraction. So make sure that you close those loops and answer any lingering questions that you believe the audience might have. In addition, this also allowed me to engage the audience by breaking the proverbial fourth wall. By talking directly to the audience, I was able to get in a little bit of audience engagement by asking a rhetorical question. The audience had it in their mind, where did this car tire come from? And now I'm sharing that moment with them about, hey, yeah, where did the car tire come from? It was just a nice way to quickly build rapport and it still fit in the speech.
This was a bad idea. So in response, Tiny Auntie wisely said, "That is a great idea." Tiny Uncle said, "Okay."
Few things to point out here. First, another example of the incongruity theory. My auntie wisely said that was a great idea. I had just said before that this was a bad idea. But then I say my tiny auntie wisely said this is setting up that, okay, she's going to say something different. She's going to say something that's going to tell everybody that it's a bad idea. But then I just totally go the other way and say that's a great idea. That incongruity creates the laugh.
They ran, grabbed the car tire, rolled it down the stairway. And it crashed through the window. At this point, you would assume the children would think, maybe we should stop, right? Wrong.
And thirdly was another example of audible variety with the tire rolling down the stairs. I do this by making a sound like a tire bouncing down the stairs, and then I have the crash. Even if you couldn't discern the exact sounds, you would have still been able to use the context clues to know that I was referring to a tire rolling down the stairs and that something was crashing. I also accentuate this with my body movement. I have the rolling down the stairs, and then I have the crash. Also in this part of the speech, there was a small wardrobe malfunction. Okay, it wasn't actual wardrobe malfunction like on the Janet Jackson level, but it was a wardrobe malfunction in that I forgot to unbutton my jacket, which would give me more range of motion as I was giving my speech. Because there are a lot of traditional-minded Toastmasters in the contest at that stage, I decided to come out with my jacket buttoned up versus having it unbuttoned from the start. When you get this far in the contest, there are going to be more traditional-minded Toastmasters as the judges. So I come on stage and give that first good impression with my jacket buttoned, and then once I go into my speech, I then unbutton my jacket. Lastly, we have an example of the superiority theory at work, where we think, okay, we would definitely be smarter than these kids if we were in their situation. That's the reason why they laugh, because they feel superior to those kids at that moment, and the logical thing would have been to stop. So we laugh because we are feeling superior to these foolish children who should have known to use basic logic and stop when they were ahead. And then I round it out with another incongruity theory where Tiny Mother says again, I have another great idea.
Instead, Tiny Mother said, I have another fun idea. Let's take a big cardboard box. Then, take Tiny Uncle. Put him inside of the box. Then slide him down the stairway. Tiny Auntie said, that is a great idea. Tiny Uncle said, wait, what?
Now, quick point right here. When I said, let's take a cardboard box, I was looking down when I said that, which means I was closer to my microphone. And when you heard the word box, it really popped. There are a lot of different words that can pop and really have this jump in sound that you don't really want because it just sounds bad to the audience when they hear it. So you want to try to make sure that you stay a certain distance away from your microphone when you use some of those poppy words. Poppy words can include anything that starts with the letter B or the letter P or the letter T. These are the words that generally pop the most whenever I speak. All in all, be mindful of where your microphone is, be mindful of where your mouth is, and be mindful of the words that you are using that can possibly pop. Also in this part of the speech, I started to escalate the stakes even higher. First we had the car tire, and now we have a small child being put inside of this box. Now, this could have created a lot of possible tension, and you could hear from the audience that they were shocked to hear that Tiny Uncle was possibly going to go inside this box. So what I had to do was make this something more benign. There are a few ways that I do this. One, I start talking about Tiny Uncle. If I said that we're going to take this 5-year-old child and put him inside of a box, I'm pretty sure that would not have been as funny because that's going to cause the audience to be more tense. But by saying Tiny Uncle, you know that he eventually becomes my uncle, and therefore you know that time has passed, he should have been all right, and there wasn't any serious harm done. Word selection matters. I also tried to ease the situation a little bit more by showing the unbridled enthusiasm of Tiny Mother as I am portraying that character. Lastly, I finally get a payoff for one of the setups that I had used in the past, and that was the clapping and Tiny Uncle saying okay. And in this case, he knows that this is not necessarily a good idea, and that is causing the audience to laugh, which is breaking the tension a bit, and it allows the situation to again be more benign when he eventually tumbles down the stairs.
They ran. They found a box. They put tiny uncle inside of the box. They closed the box. They pushed the box to the edge of the stairway. And he didn't slide, he rolled.
Now, in this part of the speech, you notice again that I'm raising the tension, and this time I'm doing it all through my voice and my pacing. I'm slowing down in action to build up the tension. I'm lowering my voice, again, building up the tension. I repeat the same words over and over again, and I also make sure every word that is used is going to be visual. Then finally, I add in that pause, again, building up that tension before giving the reveal of him tumbling down the stairs. Now, the fall itself could have been a very tense moment, and you notice that the audience didn't necessarily laugh at the child tumbling down the stairs. Again, this comes from the tension that was built of a child actually falling down the stairs. But when I give the line that he didn't slide, he rolled, that started to break that tension a little bit more. This is all just to explain to you that you have to take into account what your audience may be thinking at certain points of your speech. If you have something that you believe the audience may be offended by, or if you think that they're going to be too tense about something, try to alleviate the situation with some humor or some backstory, just as a way for them to feel more at ease and allow the humor to sink in if you're using it. Now, I understand this is easier said than done, so what I suggest is that you always have a test audience to practice out this material to see what they react to and how they react. But the true purpose was just to alleviate some of that tension that had built up and to show everybody that no tiny uncles were harmed during the creation of this speech.
My grandparents woke up, finally. At the bottom of the stairway, they found a ball, a car tire smashed through the window, and my uncle crying inside of a box.
Now, I say my grandparents woke up finally because this is probably something that the audience is thinking in their minds. After all this time, all these objects rolling down the stairs, after a car tire crashes through the window, how are your grandparents still asleep? And even though I didn't outright answer the question, I at least addressed it so that the audience knows that I'm thinking what they're thinking. And if you want to know the answer is just simply that they were sound asleep. It's just another way for me to relate to the audience by breaking that proverbial fourth wall. I also talk about tiny uncle crying in the box, again, making it seem more benign and showing you that by crying, he is still actually all right. He's not injured in any way. He doesn't have to go to the hospital or anything like that. Now, when the audience is laughing at my uncle crying inside of the box, that's possibly the relief theory at work, because we had seen tiny uncle roll down the stairs in a box, and now we are getting to know that he's okay and that he's just crying inside of the box. And that release of tension is allowing the audience to laugh and make the situation a little bit more benign so that they don't feel bad for laughing.
They administered some physical education. The children never played on the stairway again.
Something else that makes the situation a little bit less tense and more benign is using the term physical education. And there is a good reason for this. When this story took place, it was 1959. You compare that to 2019, and you'll have people that have a much different view about corporal punishment. The audience probably is not going to like it when I say that the children got spanked or they got hit with a paddle or a belt. That may have worked in 1959, not in 2019. So instead of outright saying what happened directly, I decided to utilize a technique that a lot of people utilize when they want to make a situation or a concept seem less offensive. And that is the euphemism. By saying physical education instead of outright saying that they got spanked, I allow the audience to basically surmise what happened without directly saying what happened. And that thought process, it makes the situation a little bit easier to digest, which allows the audience to laugh at the situation.
Another family story features me at 3 years old, along with my mother, who learned why you never say bad words in front of children.
Now we're transitioning into the second story, and you notice that the transition is fairly simple. I just tell you that I have another story, and then I introduce the characters. This goes to show you that your transitions don't have to be magical, they don't have to be super complex. You can have a simple transition from one point to another. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of transition words that you can use to make a simple transition from one point to another. Do not overcomplicate your transitions. You'll also notice that in this story, I give away the ending right at the beginning. My mother learns a lesson that you never say certain words in front of a child. That's the lesson, that's the ending. So you know what the ending is going to be, but you're still intrigued enough to want to know what happened. You're wanting to know what word was said. You want to know exactly what situation caused the word to be said. There's a lot of intrigue for this story, even though I gave away the ending.
Normally, my mom did not use bad words, but one day while driving with me in the back seat, another car dangerously cut in front of her. She slammed the brakes, honked the horn, and without thinking, she screamed out, "Bleep!" She could not believe the word that came out of her mouth. She looked in the back seat. She saw my face. The young Toastmaster inside of me was screaming, "Word of the day!" And what do you do with the word of the day? You use it!
This part of my speech is possibly my favorite moment in all of my years of competitive speaking. I first start things off with a euphemism in the form of a sound with the bleep. This is a euphemism for the actual word that was being used. You don't need to know which word it was. All you need to know is that it was a bad word. Then I start with a setup in the form of my pacing. I start to speed up a lot before I finally pause and then deliver the punchline, word of the day. Then there were some other things that made this line stand out even more. One, my facial expression. I just had this wildly excited expression on my face that the audience was able to see and they laughed at. In addition, I also showed more enthusiasm with my body language. I started to clap my hands and just visibly showed my enthusiasm for saying this naughty word. And if you have been paying attention, then you probably know that people were laughing because of the incongruity theory. The incongruity theory is being applied here because, one, people don't expect for a child to be thinking about the word of the day. Something else that enhances this humor is the relatability of it. Word of the day is a concept that is used in almost every Toastmasters chapter around the world. Everyone in that audience knew exactly what I was talking about. And that allowed them to laugh with one another because everybody was familiar with the term that was being used. You add this to the incongruity of a young child saying this, and that just added to one of the biggest laughs that I have ever gotten in all of my years competing in the contest. And just as a tip, whenever you're using a call and response, make sure you know for a fact that the audience is going to know the answer. I've used it for multiple audiences of multiple sizes, so I knew for a fact that they were going to say the right thing. If you aren't sure what the audience is going to say, it can make you feel very awkward when you're on stage and everybody gives different responses. So make sure that people know what to say before you give them a call and response. Now, while we're on the subject of this call and response, I may have rushed my response to the audience just a bit. And the reason why I say that I may have done it is because you may have heard that there was an echo in that room. So while I was on stage, I may have already gotten the answer that I needed to make the adequate response. But for the microphone that was being used that day, it possibly caught the audience response a little bit late, which made it seem as if my response back to the audience came early. Now, obviously, this didn't cost me anything, but in the future, just make sure that you give your audience enough time to respond before you respond back.
That night at the dinner table, my older sister made me very angry. I thought to myself, oh, do I have a word for you?
Really quick here, I think that I could have possibly gotten a bigger laugh had I exaggerated my facial expression or my body movement just a bit more. When it comes to humor, your facial expressions and your body movement can definitely add to the amount of laughs that you get. Remember, people are watching you on stage in addition to listening to you. So you can add to your humor by being more visually funny.
My mom could see it in my eyes. She said, "Aaron, don't you dare say that word." And I obeyed my mother because I was an angel and I lived happily ever after. My mom may tell you a different version of that ending, but my version is better.
Here, I actually did something that you're also told not to do when you're speaking to an audience. I lied. Anybody who was really following along in this speech knew full well that I did not actually obey my mother, and I definitely used that word. However, there was a reason why I decided to do it this way, and there's a reason why this lie wasn't as bad of a thing as other people who may stretch the truth in their speeches. Now, the reason why I decided to stretch the truth here was because the reality really wasn't that funny. My mother sternly told me not to say that word ever again. That's what really happened. It's not funny. I also didn't want to use the euphemism of physical education again because I didn't want it to be the same result because that would have been boring. I also didn't want the audience to think, does every single person in your family solve problems through violence? Trust me, there are Toastmasters who think this way. I can't help it, but I try to get in front of it. When I talk about obeying my mother, I'm doing so in a very exaggerated way. I'm trying to really point out the fact that I am not telling the truth here. I want to be so blatantly obvious with this lie that you know it's a lie and you know what the truth actually is. I also tell you that my mother had a different version of that ending, which again lets you know that my version of the story isn't necessarily the accurate one. Now, just a way that I think that I could have improved this even more, I could have paused just a little bit longer when I told the audience that my mother had a different version of the ending. I could have absorbed that time to allow more laughter, but whatever. It obviously didn't cost me anything.
However, let's pause right here. After hearing both of these stories, what do you think we are feeling right now? Just think.
Now here I utilize a rhetorical question and a pause. When you ask a rhetorical question, if you believe that the answer is so obvious that the audience doesn't need time to think, that's when you can just move along in your speech. However, if you have a rhetorical question where you want the audience to truly think about the answer, you have to give them time to think about the answer. Now, how long do you wait, you may ask? It's going to depend on the question. If it's a fairly simple question, then you only need a few seconds. If it's something that the audience needs to actually do some contemplation, give them about 5 to 7 seconds. This isn't concrete. Everybody is different and every speech is different. But these are just some of the guidelines that I use for my own speeches.
What I believe we are feeling is unity.
So here you notice that I use a certain hand gesture when I say the word unity. The reason why I do this is because unity is an abstract word. It really doesn't create an image in your head. So to make it easier for you to visualize unity, I give you a certain hand gesture which will stand for the word unity. You're able to see this hand gesture, and now whenever I say unity, you'll see this. Just a quick little tip to help bring more visualization to certain abstract words.
We were united in laughter when 3-year-old Aaron expanded his vocabulary. We were united in horror and shock as tiny uncle rolled down the stairs in that box.
Generally, the way that I like to perform my speeches, I like to give you a lot of humor and fast pace up front, and then I'll slow down and become more somber as I'm giving you the message. Personally, I feel that I'm able to build a stronger connection when I utilize my humor up front rather than using a more somber story up front and then having to build the audience up with humor before giving them the message. I just think it's easier the other way around. In addition, I'm also explaining how the stories were connected with one another. Before, these stories didn't seem like they were related at all, but through this common theme, I'm able to bring them together, or you could say that I unified them. It's kind of meta when you think about it.
Family stories transcend race, culture, politics, and religion. Do you know why? Because we all have family. We all have those relatable family moments that can foster unity. And I don't know about you, I think the world can use a lot more unity nowadays. Would you agree?
Now I come back to the special power that I talked about earlier in the speech. The reference to a special power was a setup, and now I'm going to have the payoff here. And the reason why I do this in most of my speeches because I don't want my speeches to be overly predictable. I don't want you to know exactly what's going to be coming. Therefore, I plant seeds at the beginning and then give you some ideas that may not seem relatively connected before I bring them all together, and retroactively, you're able to connect the dots and say, oh, that's how they're connected. Also, in this part of the speech, I give you a message that is relatable and relevant. It was relevant to the times in 2019. It was relevant to the times now, honestly. It's always going to be relevant because we can always use more unity and more understanding. This is a case of an obvious answer, and that way I don't have to wait too long for the audience to respond. Now, one point that I will bring up is that this was a rhetorical question. I didn't necessarily need the audience to respond. However, it didn't matter if the audience responded or not, because there was very little chance that I was going to get an answer that I did not want. However, this is just a warning whenever you use a rhetorical question in your speeches. Don't ask a question that you truly do not want an answer to.
Then what are your favorite family stories? I ask you to share those stories with the world. Your family stories can spread the gift of unity. And that is why they are the greatest stories that we will ever hear.
Now here, I give you a direct call to action. I tell you to share your family stories. This was my do, think, or know, or my DToKs. I wanted my audience to share their family stories. And I tell them this exactly at the end of the speech. And then I subvert your expectations by going back to my title, that our family stories are the greatest stories that we'll ever hear. Not just mine, not just yours, but all of ours. And that was a way, again, of using my title to my advantage. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is my review of my semifinal speech. Again, if you got any value out of this, please make sure that you hit the like button. And if you haven't already, make sure that you subscribe to the channel and press the notification bell for more content like this. Until next time, my friends, take care.